want to start by saying how delighted I am to be here. It's an honor to participate in this beginning of a discussion about documentary photography. I want to thank Carlos for his support in this, but also in the Lewis Hine exhibition that you'll have a chance to see next year. And to all of the team of the Mapfre Foundation, this is a most impressive organization. History is not what happened. It's the story that we tell about the past to justify the future. And what I want to do tonight is consider the idea of the documentary photograph as it was developed in the 1930s by a few influential American critics, theorists, and practitioners, especially Beaumont Newhall. Newhall was the first curator of my institution, George Eastman House, and the author of the influential survey, The History of Photography, which has been through many publications, many incarnations, but really began as late as 1938. At several points within the history of photography, we see a search for precursors, for spiritual ancestors, for a conscious review of the past, and a telling choice of these spiritual ancestors. So the pictorialists, and here we see a picture of Alfred Stieglitz, one of the most famous pictorialists, but also including Clarence White, Edward Steichen, and Gertrude Casimir. They made soft focus romantic images that were often metaphoric or allegorical. Not surprisingly, when they mined the past, they turned up soft focus romantic images that were often metaphoric and allegorical, such as Julia Margaret Cameron and Hill Adamson. So of all the photographs made before their time, these are the photographs that the pictorialists claimed, celebrated, published, and cited. We see the same thing happening in the search for documentary models, a conscious review of the photographs of the past with an effort to identify the ones that suited the version of history that these people were looking for. Now, in 1938, a young Harvard-educated librarian at the Museum of Modern Art undertook a similar historical exercise in search of appropriate precursors and for definitions, trying to find people whose work in the past supported the contemporary work that he admired in order to justify certain photographs being made in the 1930s as contemporary art. What Beaumont Newhall was looking for was precursors whose early work suggested an obvious progress to his present. So Beaumont Newhall, born in 1908, was educated at Harvard University. He was educated in art history by Paul Sachs, the important and influential educator who really began to codify the idea of modern art in the United States. Beaumont went to the Museum of Modern Art, first as the librarian, and later as the first director of the Department of Photography. He went to George Eastman House in 1948 as curator, became its director in 1958, stayed until 1971, and then moved to the University of New Mexico, where he worked until his retirement. Beaumont Newhall admired certain American photographers whose work fit his notion of contemporary art and modern art. One of them was Walker Evans. The other was Charles Sheeler. And I think it's helpful to keep these photographs in mind as we watch Newhall's retrospective view of the entire history of photography, working backwards from this kind of late 1930s modernism. I want to look at the early efforts of Newhall to define documentary or documentary style. They're different. Documentary style is actually a phrase that Beaumont Newhall himself used, and Walker Evans did too. But Beaumont also spoke about documentary, and that's the beginning of a distinction that I'm going to try to make. Documentary or documentary style as a form of photographic art. And I want to pay particular attention to his first article, published in Parnassus, the American Academic Journal of the College Art Association, which began in 1929. This is the first writing in which Newhall, or really anyone else dealing with the still photograph, attempted to define documentary, indeed used the word documentary to talk about a still photograph. That's the article. A short article in which he considers the meaning of documentary and identified several early practitioners whose work, made before the concept of documentary had been articulated, met the post facto criteria that he and others were establishing. So what we're really looking at is the history of an idea here. And we're looking at how that idea gets filtered in the way it looks at the past in order to identify a few benchmarks in the 19th century that could be used to justify documentary photography by a mid-20th century definition. Now, in this article in Parnassus, Newhall does cite a couple of definitions. He talks about Paul Grier's use in French of document in 1905 to describe some photographs of Victor Hugo. But his two earliest citations of the word documentary in English are tellingly both from theorists of the motion picture history, not about still photography, and both of them are talking about the movies. This is what they are. John Grierson, generally considered to be the first person to use the word documentary in English, in 1926, calls documentary the creative treatment of actuality. And somewhat later, Paul Rotha, talking actually about the same group of films, calls documentary a dramatic presentation of fact. Now we have to realize that in the 1920s, motion pictures were still figuring out what they were. No one really knew what a motion picture was supposed to look like, what it was supposed to be. And in these early years, Grierson's reference especially is to the particular films of Robert Flaherty, probably best known in Europe for Nanak of the North, but also for Moana of the South Seas, Louisiana Story, and a number of other short films. Flaherty is known as the father of documentary film, although that too is a post facto definition. Flaherty made Nanak in 1922, Moana in 1926, and his last, The Land in 1942 was probably the closest to our later ideas of documentary because it was made under the auspices of the Farm Securities Administration and the WPA, the New Deal firms that sponsored photographs you'll be hearing more about in this series. But Nanak of the North, the first film, was made at a time when, motion pictures were not even 20 years old. And Nanak was a romantic movie, a dramatized study of Native people in the Canadian North, where Flaherty had worked as a prospector for several years. The film was promoted as actual, as true, but it also stressed drama, thrill, and action. The overwrought dramatic language of the silent film era contributed to this sense of romanticism, but the visual vocabulary of this film was equally heroic. So we have the image of the heroic Eskimo fighting against the elements. But it was actually Flaherty's 1926 film, Moana of the South Seas, for which Grierson coined the word documentary. And this movie was an unabashedly romantic, it was a love story, which emphasized traditional Polynesian customs over contemporary adaptations to the Western world. And it was greatly influenced by Frances Flaherty, Robert's wife, a pictorialist photographer and a classically educated writer. Her ideas of what Polynesia was supposed to be like very much influenced this film. And yet, it was presented as a kind of reality. And still, in the discussion of motion picture history, these are the films that are cited as the first documentaries. Now, I'd like to go back to the Newhall article in Parnassus. The article references 21 photographers, but it reproduces the work of only 4: Henri Lessec, Arthur Rothstein, Louis Hine, and Alexander Gardner, whom Newhall identifies only by the name of the studio that employed him. And Newhall reproduces a Lessec as the only full-page illustration, and he also discusses him at length. He says, Lessec's series has seldom been surpassed by all the hundreds of cameramen who have visited Chartres since 1852. Yet they were not unique. They were not unique in factual content. Their technique, that of the calotype, did not permit a high resolution of details. What is told about the physical structure of Chartres was not revealed for the first time because lithographed documents by the most meticulous craftsmen had already appeared. Lessec's photographs are a sympathetic interpretation of Chartres. They are a direct record, not only of the carved stones, but of the photographer's emotion in viewing them, and this is important. And they represent only what actually stood in front of his camera on the day in 1852 when he exposed his negatives. This is another reproduction from his article, the Arthur Rothstein, the Louis Hine, and the Alexander Gardner, identified as Matthew Brady. The 3 elements that Newhall stresses when he is talking about documentary photographs are that they are sympathetic, that they are emotional, and that they are true. The emotional part is probably important because he is fighting the idea that these are images made by a machine. There is sympathy because there is a connection between the photographer and the subject, and therefore between the audience and the subject. They are true because they represent what was actually there. They contain information. And all of these elements continue to be important, not only in Newhall's application of the word documentary in the late 1930s, but even today in our understanding of what documentary means. So let's look at Lessec. Now, Newhall was undoubtedly familiar with the look and feel of a vintage Lessec. We don't know exactly what photographs Beaumont Newhall was looking at in the 1930s when he was constructing his history of photography. But we can assume that he knew to some extent what the vintage Lessecs looked like. This is a reproduction of a cyanotype, and this is a reproduction of a salted paper print from a calotype, from a paper negative, made as early as 1852. And Beaumont Newhall, in discussing Lessec, clearly forgives their inability to render sharp detail, even though that becomes very important to the idea of the look of documentary. However, the object that is reproduced in Parnassus was not from a calotype negative, was not a salted paper print, and was not a cyanotype. It was a lithograph. And I find that very important because the lithograph more resembles the kind of sharper black and white image that we associate with documentary film and the reality, the truth-telling of documentary photographs today. And of course, in 1938, the qualities of offset printing, even though Parnassus was a high-end journal doing the best printing possible for reproducing photographs, that offset litho would have looked quite different from the original object that Newhall is talking about. So when we compare the reproduction to a vintage print, we see that the reproduction feels closer to the cool tonality and the strong graphic composition of modernists like Evans and Sheeler. So if you compare these two, the lithograph, the black and white image, looks much more like a Sheeler or an Evans than the salted paper print from the paper negative. And I find this significant. I mean, notice how the printing process in the black and white image emphasizes the graphic nature of the vertical lines that you see on the side of the print. And if you compare the black and white image to these images by Evans and Sheeler, you can see how the lithograph might have been more appealing to Newhall and his peers than the actual original vintage print. Here's another example of how changing the photographic process changes the feeling of a photographic image. This is an odd thing that I found in our collection while I was researching for this little talk. This is a Le Sec image made in 1852, printed as a gelatin silver print in 1937 by Edward Steichen. We have only the negatives, so we don't know what the actual calotype, what the actual salted paper print would have looked like, but surely it did not look like this. The sharp, high contrast, the rendering of this image as an interesting composition of geometric shapes, of squares and triangles, is very much Steichen's interpretation of Le Sec's negative. Another early photographer whom Newhall includes in his retroactive survey of documentary's ancestors is Charles Marville. Like Le Sec, Marville was trained as a painter, and he's best known for his luminous and detailed Parisian cityscapes and for his systematic survey, important word, that was about of the Paris that was about to be lost to Haussmann's urban renewal. I'm particularly interested in this series of Marville images, Mélange photographique, which was done as albuminized, developed out, salted paper prints mounted on boards, all the same, that had been printed with letterpress. The way of their consistent titling, the way of mounting them all in the same way, makes them much more indexical, much more work in a series, scientific in a way that is very much, again, in keeping with one of the aspects of documentary as we understand it today. And this portfolio, published in 1851, is considered one of the first efforts at mass production of photographs. They produced about 300 proofs per day, and the work of reproducing these negatives was done almost entirely by women, and they were used to make these luxury editions of photographs. And in his 1938 essay, Newhall notes approvingly, "It is paradoxical that although a photograph may be better than 1,000 words, the addition of 1 or 2 words makes it even more concrete and forceful." He talks about Marville in this way, but it's also important to him when he talks about Lersac. He says, when Lersac signed his negative, Chart 1852, he immediately gave the photograph an increased value as a document. So certainly this kind of indexical presentation would have enhanced, in Newhall's thinking, the documentary value of this work. Now, when Newhall talks about an Alexander Gardner image, he doesn't identify Gardner by name. This is the image that's reproduced in Parnassus. He identifies it as the Matthew Brady Studio, which was being used then as a catch-all for the work of Alexander Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan, William Pywell, George Barnard, Thomas Roche, and 18 other men who worked for Matthew Brady, producing photographs of the American Civil War using wet plate collodion technology. Now, collodion gives you a beautifully detailed negative if you're very lucky. It's a difficult process. And Gardner was one of the people who mastered this process. There's his dark tent. And documented the Civil War. But bear in mind that for most people during the Civil War, the images that they consumed of the war looked like this. They didn't look like a sharp collodion negative. They didn't have the immediacy of a sharp collodion negative print. These were engravings, usually using a photo made with a photograph just as a guide for the engraver. And this is, they did not, therefore, partake of the emotional, the actuality, and the sense of witness that Newhall found in the originals. So here we have a case where the historian, mining the past, seizes upon original photographs that were not part of the visual culture of the time. The originals were discovered later. They were almost incidental in the process of getting an engraving like this, but it was the originals that Beaumont was drawn to because they had the kind of sharpness and immediacy that he was looking for in photographs. So that's the kind of sharpness that a collodion negative would give you, but this is not something that most people would have experienced. Another albumen print from the Civil War period, generally consumed in another format, that the detailed prints from a large collodion negative are completely different from the soft gray wood engraving that people would have known. So here we have an example of an albumen print. This is the kind of thing that, the kind of way in which these images were consumed at the time of their making. And there's an engraving made from the same image that Gardner made, but it's been adapted, often rather carelessly, by the engraver. And the sense of the need for authenticity is simply not there. There you see them side by side. But by the 1930s, even as this kind of journalistic photograph was being subject to study by art historians, it was the actual prints that were being studied and their qualities of immediacy and accuracy that were applauded. That's what let Newhall claim this work as proto-documentary. Here's another pair. Note that the image has been reversed. The background has been simplified, and the soldier has been brought fully into the frame by the engraver because it supports the narrative of these stories. Even the stark modernist image that Newhall selects as proto-documentary is actually a fragment of a more conventional panoramic whole. Timothy O'Sullivan was another one of Brady's cameramen whose Civil War work was probably known to Newhall, though quite possibly only in reproduction. But it's the later topographical work that Newhall speaks of, again, with very little emphasis on the maker or the maker's intent. So that's a Civil War photograph by O'Sullivan, but it was this kind of work, as an albumin print, that Newhall was really concerned with when he started to seek spiritual ancestors in the field of documentary. These photographs were originally made as records of explorations. They were filed away in the archives of the United States Geological Survey, and he says, "These photographs of the canyons have seldom been equaled." Now, the trajectory of these particular objects is very revealing. In the late 1800s, these photographs and other photographs like them were purchased by the geology department of Harvard, using funds that were specifically bequeathed for the purchase of photographs and lantern slides as visual aids in the teaching of geology and geography. The collection became inactive in 1914. And round about 1960, the geologists at Harvard decided you really couldn't teach geology by showing people photographs of stones. And so they were going to throw the material away. They gave it to Eastman House instead. We were interested in all kinds of photographs, and they include these remarkable, very large albumin prints of the American West. And they are now, starting about 1980, they were considered great art. So they moved from being records, documents of a geological survey, to being understood as a teaching tool in a geology department at a university, to being understood as just part of the history of photography. That's why Eastman House collected them. And later, with changes in their interpretation, and indeed in the sites where they were exhibited, they became to be understood as art and are now considered some of the great artistic treasures of the legacy of American photography. Now, we can imagine how this kind of harshly abstracted fragment of landscape would have appealed to someone like Newhall, trained in modern art, and especially perhaps as a black and white illustration rather than as a somewhat more softly toned albumin print. Other images of canyons that Beaumont was probably alluding to is this epic image of Shoshone Falls. This is quite a large photograph. But again, bear in mind that at the time of their making, the engraving that most people were familiar with was quite a different matter. Now, Newhall speaks briefly of Atget, linking him to Marville, saying, "To experience aesthetically the face of that great city, fairly to breathe at will its atmosphere, we consult the work of two photographers who would be called documentary today." So it's Newhall who is claiming Atget as a documentary photographer. It is unlikely that Atget would have claimed himself as a documentary photographer because the concept was not in play, the word was not in use for the discussion of still photographs at that time. I'm not going to discuss these photographs because you'll be hearing a great deal more about them later in the week. Now, Newhall lists a number of younger photographers in his discussion of documentary, and he positions them as having built on the generations before them by sensing the artistic strength of such photographic documents as these. the precursors he has designated, Lussac, Gardner, etc., and see in this approach, this materialistic approach, the basis for an aesthetic of photography. So he lists these photographers as people who have seen and been influenced by the photographers that he discusses earlier. Now, I think it's interesting that, Ansel Adams is not someone we generally associate with the term documentary today. His work is, too epic, too grand, and somehow neutral, without the sort of quotidian elements that we expect from documentary. I think we expect documentary to be a little bit funkier, a little bit more of the street. Yet Newhall, in this article in 1938, as he's still sorting out his ideas, claims that Adams, like Walker Evans, Ralph Steiner, and Margaret Bourke-White, has produced straightforward photographs of great technical excellence, interpreting not only the world nearest to them, but also its social significance. Now, I'm not sure that this is a photograph in which I see a lot of social significance, although, of course, these photographs were used to encourage the legislature in the United States to identify and create national parks. I don't see that as inherent in these photographs. And yet it's important to notice that in the 1930s, as all of these concepts were being worked out, as this history of photography was being invented, that Adams was cited as a documentary photographer. Now, it's much easier to see social significance in the work of Arthur Rothstein, who I'm also not going to discuss at any length because he will be covered in a subsequent lecture. But this is the image that Newhall chose to reproduce in his article as one of only 4. A rather typical FSA photograph by Rothstein. Again, showing poverty, showing the other, another element which becomes increasingly important in our notion of documentary. But what I do want to consider is one photograph by Rothstein that relates to the 1930s search for documentary spiritual ancestors. This is quite a notorious image. Now, Rothstein made this photograph while he was working for the FSA in 1936. And he took 5 different pictures of this skull, and he moved the skull each time. He describes it as just a lot of photographic exercises. But the image was published, and there you see a variant of it. The image was published as evidence, as proof and truth of the drought in the American West. And when it was discovered that the photograph had been essentially staged, that the photograph had been set up, that Rothstein took this skull and moved it to a place where the background was particularly appropriate for the kind of photograph he was going to make, he was attacked. The FSA was attacked. President Roosevelt was attacked. The entire New Deal was attacked. And all of their efforts to persuade people in cities that the people in the country were starving to death, that this was the worst drought in the century, all of them were denied. And it was Republicans, it was the political party that was opposed to Roosevelt that did this. But in order to defend all of the photographic projects of the FSA, Roy Stryker, the director of this great photographic project, published assertions that documentary meant no staging or altering of the subject of any kind. No staging. It had to be simply what was in front of the camera. This is important because it was not until 1937 that this rule, if it is a rule, was established. And so this idea of authenticity and the idea of the invisible photographer, there should be no evidence that the photographer was present in this documentary genre. This is a new idea introduced for very pragmatic reasons in 1937. And when this rule is applied retroactively, it can be very confusing. So when that rule is applied to photographs made before the rule was made, we can get very confused. Thus, Louis Hine has been faulted for staging some of his most important pictures. Hine's writing, on the other hand, indicates that he understood himself as creating symbols, as a way to move his work away from journalism's insistence on immediate fact. And this 1921 image certainly could not be held to adhere to rules that were made some 15 years later. Hine staged this photograph. We have dozens of variants of this photograph in the collection at George Eastman House. And in Parnassus, Newhall writes briefly about Louis Hine. He reproduces one small picture. He refers only to his earliest photographs, his photographs of child labor, taken, and I'm quoting Newhall here, for sociological propaganda, saying they must be considered portraits, poignant in their stark and direct seizure of the emotion of both photographer and subject. But again, Newhall acknowledges that these photographs were not made as art. They were certainly not made as documentary photographs, but they were made as evidence. They were made as evidence of a wrong, of children being forced to work in factories, and they were not made to be consumed in art museums or in art publications. They were made as part of the great reform movement of the early 20th century, and they were made to persuade people that these things existed. Yet what Newhall is responding to is the sympathy between the photographer and his subject, which becomes much more important later when he is talking about people like Walker Evans. Now, I'm kind of intrigued by the similarities between Hine's portraits and Walker Evans' portraits, where the complicit subject's gaze connects both with the photographer and thus with us, the viewers, even generations later. This is hardly the invisible photographer. The presence of the photographer and the emotional connection of the photographer with these individuals is a critical part of the power of these photographs. Now, Newhall does speak positively of a kind of candid street-style photography that does, in fact, suggest that the photographer was invisible. And he speaks specifically about Eric Solomon's, quote, absolutely amazing unposed portraits, but he distinguishes them from casual snapshots by anyone whose pocketbook can afford a miniature camera. So he's already beginning to make a distinction between casually made photographs and artistically made photographs that may resemble the snapshot, but he does make a distinction. Now, I was surprised to find that this seminal article by Newhall leaves out two precursors that are almost always included in surveys of documentary photography and early documentary photography today. Two people who are today, I think, pretty inextricably linked with the idea of documentary. And that's John Thompson, who was working in London in the 1860s, and Jacob Riis, who was working in New York in the 1880s. Neither photographer is mentioned in the Parnassus article, in the 1937 Museum of Modern Art catalog by Newhall, photography 1839-1937, and it's in fact not until much later editions of Newhall's The History of Photography that either of these photographers is included. And yet today, I think in most studies, college courses, and textbooks that deal with documentary, Thompson is one of the photographers we have to consider, as is Jacob Riis. Again, we don't really know what Newhall was looking at in the 1930s. I'm kind of determined to find out. So Thompson was born in Edinburgh and educated there in arts, science, and philosophy. In 1862, he traveled to Singapore, and for the next 10 years, he stayed in Asia, in Southeast Asia and South Asia, working as a photographer, living first in Siam, now Thailand, and in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and in China. And again, his photographs would have been reproduced as engravings, but these are the photographs that we know today that are considered proto-documentary. Now, in 1872, Thompson returned to England, where he turned his kind of ethnographer's eye on the exotic inhabitants of East London. He published Street Life in London in 1878 as a book, but it was published for 12 months in 1875 and 1876 as a monthly serial. Now, importantly, the book used the Woodbury-type process, where a photographic negative is exposed onto a printing plate, which was then inked for printing. It was the first photomechanical process that began to give us a sharp, detailed, realistic image, which much of the immediacy and authenticity of an original photograph. And his subject was the public life of the poor. Let's again remember that by the 1940s, the idea of documentary very often included the idea that we would photograph, we would document the poor, the downtrodden. And in this case, Thompson was offering his middle-class readers a vicarious journey to different, difficult, and possibly dangerous parts of the City of London. These images are always posed. The technology would not allow for anything else. And they're often picturesque. I think these images were presented in the spirit of the expedition, not in the spirit of reform. And this is important when we think about Jacob Riis and Lewis Hine coming later. There's an intellectual link to the popular genre and occupational engravings of people like Hogarth and later people who were imaging the street life of London. And he used these photographs of familiar street types. These were types that were well known: the strawberry seller, the flower seller, well known in literature, in popular music. These were the genres that the middle class associated with the poor when they thought about London. Beaumont Newhall does not discuss Thompson's work until the 5th edition of the History of Photography, which was the first to draw all of its illustrations from the Eastman House collection. And this suggests to me that Newhall came to know Thompson's work later. I feel quite certain that had he in 1938 been familiar with this work, that he would have included it as an early prototype. Jacob Riis, again, not included in the 1938 article in Parnassus, but is mentioned in the first issue of the History of Photography in 1938. Now, Riis was born in Denmark in 1849, and he emigrated to the United States in 1870, so quite a young man. He worked as a carpenter, a miner, an itinerant farm worker, and as a maker of bricks, and he was often homeless. He himself was quite poor, and it gave him a kind of connection to the poor people whom he would later photograph. He eventually secured a position as a newspaper writer and later as a newspaper editor and owner. As a police reporter at the New York Tribune, he took advantage of his knowledge of the slums to expose crime, poverty and substandard housing of the Lower East Side. He often wrote in a very melodramatic style, and his writing was much more important than his photography. The first photographs that Hine's stories used were not, that Riis's stories used, were not taken by Riis. They were taken by commissioned photographers. We don't know who they were. But he soon began making his own photographs. And it was, again, a technological innovation that allowed photographs like this to be made. It was the invention of flash powder as a way to illuminate dark nighttime scenes like this that permitted Riis to make this kinds of pictures. And he was actually one of the first photographers in the United States to use flash. So these people, I'm one of the few people alive who has had the privilege of seeing what magnesium flash powder looks like when it's used. It's a great bright flash, it's very smoky, and it smells terrible. So these people in this picture have been sleeping, and suddenly a stranger has walked into their bedroom. He has lit off this great smelly, smoky thing. You can see that they're sitting up looking quite shocked. I don't see the sympathy in this picture that Newhall would have asked for. And it's no wonder that Riis usually traveled with a police escort. One of the questions we must always ask ourselves when we consider documentary photographs of the poor is, where does the power lie? Does the photographer, with the power to intrude and make that picture, have power over the subjects with whom we would like to see some kind of sympathy? Riis's photographs are often posed. In his book, The Battle with the Slum, he describes very specifically how he paid slum boys to pose for this picture. His work was reformist in his concern for mothers and children, and it was really, he was quick to condemn the criminals and the unemployed. He's considered the precursor of the reform movement, but the way he was thinking at the very beginning of the last century soon changed into a broader, more sympathetic view of the other half. Riis's work, too, was generally consumed as crude woodcuts or halftones. The photographs that we value now were not well known, and the large collection of prints now held at the Museum of the City of New York does represent a form of these photographs that was not generally seen until much more recently, until we began mining the past for examples that would allow us to find the ancestors of documentary. So it's important to remember that neither Riis nor Thompson could have been understood as documentary when they were made. Hine was understood as documentary at the very, very end of his life because the concept had not been established and the word had not been used. So these photographs maybe mark a transition in the reform movement from a kind of muckraking, word-based judgment to a sympathetic, more visually oriented ennobling. Today, I think we have to understand them as fragments of the past that were picked from the past in the 1930s to justify a new photographic approach and to justify the documentary being made in the 1930s as contemporary art worthy of being hung in art museums. Thank you.